Hello and welcome to this video which looks at the mechanism behind pain in the muscles and joints. So I'll start to talk about how an event can occur which then leads on to pain and how that happens. Then I will explain the evolutionary purpose and advantage served by pain. There is one. And then I will look at how we can stop pain from occurring. And finally, I'll look at why sometimes pain comes back after we'd initially cured it, and I'll try and explain how you can stop that pain from coming back and what are the pitfalls to avoid there. So first up, the mechanism behind pain in the muscles and joints. Well, there's a couple of different types of event that can spark off a pain cycle. So one is an event, a one-off trauma, and the other thing is overuse. So that's over a long period of time you continue to use a muscle incorrectly, and then that overuse is straining the muscle. So both these things, either the one-off event or the overuse, both have the same result on the muscle, and that result is that the muscle is strained. The muscle is at risk of damage. So just to give you examples of these, an event could be a slip on ice. So if you slip on ice, the muscles are putting under a large sudden strain. For instance, like the muscles in the groin might get strained from a slip on ice. An overuse injury, that might be something like every time you stand up off a chair, your knee caves in relative to your feet. And you might not realise it, but that's an improper movement pattern, and that will be it will be straining certain muscles more than they're meant to be strained, and it happens again and again and again, because it happens every time you stand up out of the chair, and therefore that causes overuse problems. So both these things, the event and an overuse, have led to a muscle is now at risk of being damaged. So this is when the pain mechanism starts to kick in. The muscle, not wanting to get damaged, not wanting to get torn in half or whatnot, will try and protect itself. Now it does this through creating knots in the muscle, or trigger points. Now what a knot in your muscles are is they're actually permanent contractions of the muscle fibres. So normally when a muscle works, if you've got the fibres, parallel fibres here like this, they contract like this to shorten the muscle and move the joint that the muscle controls, and then they relax here to allow the joint to move in the other direction. So they'll contract and relax like this. Now when a muscle is trying to protect itself, it will send a nervous signal to a small section along that muscle to permanently contract. So it might only be a section about 1 inch long, or even less, along the middle of a length of muscle, and it will be the nervous impulse will say, look, just lock up, and then it just won't relax. It will just be permanently locked in that contraction like that. So that does two things. It means that little section of the muscle is now completely ineffective, because it can't do this contract, relax and create movement, so it just does nothing. The rest of the muscle, it's not in a permanent knot, it can still contract and relax as normal, but because a section of the muscle is permanently shortened, permanently contracted, the rest of the muscle gets pulled tight, so it gets pulled taut. And you can feel that tightness in the muscles when it's got injured like that. And when the muscle's tight, it will be permanently tugging on the joint that muscle activates. So for instance, if we're talking about one of the muscles in our quadriceps, in our upper thighs, if that muscle is now shortened, it will permanently be pulling a little bit on the patellar tendon and the kneecap. So if the kneecap is permanently being pulled, it's going to close the joint space, it's going to close the space around that joint, and so the bones in that joint will get closer together. So in the case of where the muscle around the kneecap is tighter, the kneecap will be pulled in one direction closer to the bones that the kneecap moves within, which is in the top of the femur. But I mean, this mechanism applies to any joint, knee, hip, shoulder, whatever. I mean, imagine it's in the hip, a muscle that normally rotates the hip outward. Now, if that was permanently shorter than it would be, the hip would be turned in that place more, and that part of the hip, the joint space is smaller. So when the joint space is decreased, then there's more potential for that joint to hurt. The bones are closer together. Often, if the muscles are tight around that, it will be causing improper movement around that joint. The joint might be moving properly. If something's not moving properly, it hurts. The bones rub together when they shouldn't, and there you go. That's our pain. So we've come from a muscle being at risk of being damaged now to a joint hurting. So it starts in the muscles, it ends in the joints. So then, what's the whole point of that? Why has that helped us? You probably think it doesn't, because it really hurts, and yeah, it's not nice. But in some respects, this mechanism has actually served its purpose. It stopped you from using that muscle that was at risk of damage. So if, for instance, a muscle in your thigh, you were risking damaging it, and now it's making your knee hurt, if your knee hurts, you're not going to want to use those muscles again, because you don't want to use the knee. So the body that way has protected itself from that damage. I think it's useful if you can understand the evolutionary advantage of having this pain mechanism. And I think probably the best way to demonstrate that would be to consider if you had two different tribes of human beings back in the days of sort of hunter-gathering, say, and one of these tribes did have that pain mechanism and the other one didn't. So, for example, if you're the group that didn't have that pain mechanism, you might decide that the best way to hunt a deer would be to climb up 50 feet up into a tree and then jump out of the tree and try and land on the deer. Now, that's going to cause a massive impact, and it's just going to tear the muscles to shreds. That they're just going to rip right in two. But if there's no pain signal there, you're not going to know that it was that caused the problem. And so, presuming you could get back up again and move, you're just going to continue to do things like that when you hunt, because you've got no feedback to ever tell you to stop doing it, to stop damaging those muscles. And so, eventually all your muscles will just get torn to shreds, and then you won't be able to move at all, and then you really will die. Whereas the tribe that had that pain mechanism, okay, it's bad because like that they'll do something and they'll get injured, and then the motion around that joint that muscle operates, that joint will get locked up, and that they'll be out of action for a bit. But hopefully it would only keep them down for a couple of days until some other healing processes come in there. So there is a use behind it. I think one of the difficulties that happens now in the modern world is that, if you remember at the start I discussed that you've either got an impact, like a major event, or it's something that happens long term, so it's overuse. And more often than not, the things are overuse. So when you get these pain signals to tell you to stop doing something, you might not have even known what that thing you were doing that was wrong. So you were overusing something, but you didn't know you were overusing something. Again, like that example I gave where your knee moves into the inside of the foot every time you stand up. Now, unless someone had ever pointed out to you that that's an incorrect movement pattern, you would have never known that, and so you'll continually do that wrong. So that's something I'm going to look at more in kind of the fourth part of this video, but I'm going to go now onto the third part, which is probably the most useful part, which is how do we break this pain cycle? How do we how do we get out of this position where the muscle's in a permanent contraction and it's locked up the muscle, and then that makes the joint hurt. So the question arises when you're looking at how to break off this pain cycle is, how do you deactivate this permanent knot, this permanent contraction in the muscle? Is there a way to switch that off? Well, fortunately, yes, it can be switched off. There's two ways. There's one way which you're never going to do, and I've never done it, and it's not even as reliable, and that's to get a syringe with like Novocaine in it or something like that, some numbing agent, and inject the area of the muscle with this numbing agent, and it'll relax the knot. But I mean that's just completely unrealistic. So you're not going to, don't do that. Instead, you need to use massage. And that doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking, but what you need to understand is what are the mechanisms that go on when you do massage. Basically, if you imagine you're applying mechanical pressure directly on this knot, you've got this bit of these contractile muscle proteins that are frozen to this permanent knot. If you apply massage pressure to that, well, for one, it hurts, and what that's kind of doing is, when that's hurting, some nervous impulses will be going through those tissues, and what kind of happens, it's a bit crazy what happens, but in those new nervous impulses of just that pressure, it kind of confuses and disrupts the nervous signal that's currently gone to the muscle, that's told it to switch on and stay in that permanent knot. So a lot of those nervous signals that were presently saying switch on, switch on, switch on, are now just being confused because they're just being squashed, and they're having all these sort of massage type pain signals to them, and some of those impulses will actually relax. So that's part of the reason how massage helps to deactivate these knots, these trigger points. The other way it helps is, it's almost like you're applying a micro stretch to that area. So as you squash that, it's like you're squashing the fibers. It's almost like they're sort of kind of like stretching apart a little bit. And then there's actually a third thing as well. It's as you apply that pressure, you're actually squeezing out all the waste products, like lactic acid, for instance, that have got sort of caught up in that knot, and you're squeezing those out. So there you go. There's the three things that mechanical pressure can do to get rid of those knots. And then as soon as you've got rid of those knots, then that part of the muscle restores to its normal length, and then it can contract and it can relax, and so it becomes functional again. And then the whole rest of the muscle, because it's no longer being pulled taut by that knot section, now can restore its normal length. The muscle then has gone to its normal length. Then the joint space around the joint that that muscle controls is then back to normal. So then the function around that joint is normal, and then your joint stops hurting. So massage is brilliant if you do it right. And I've got videos on this channel. It's on a video called Self-Treatment of Patellar Maltracking, which is a very kind of specific knee condition. But it's called Parts 3A and Parts 3B of a 9-part series I did on that condition. If you go to those videos, there's actually some really good, it's called foam rolling exercises, which is a form of self-administered massage, and that's really good for showing you how to treat a lot of injuries and break down those knots. Also, YouTube is absolutely full of videos on foam rolling and self-myofascial release, or SMR. So make sure you do some Google searches and check those out. So now let's imagine you've managed to disrupt this pain cycle, and you've applied some massage to the knots that are in the muscles that were affecting the joint and making that joint hurt, and your joint pain's gone away now. But what's going to happen in a lot of cases, particularly if the initial cause of that injury was an overuse injury as opposed to an impact event, what most people often do is they'll go back to moving and overusing those muscles in exactly the same way they were before, because they have absolutely no idea what it was they were doing wrong. So that overuse will just start again. Those particular muscles will get strained more so than they should do, and then the muscle knots up, the whole pain cycle starts over again. So how do you stop that from happening again? Well, the answer is you need to learn what it was you were doing wrong in movement wise and fix those movements. Now, fortunately, a lot of movement problems can be fixed with one basic exercise, which is the squat. Now, the squat, there's actually a lot to the squat. There's a lot of joints involved. Works for the ankles, your knees, your hips, your back, to some extent even your shoulders if you start to hold a bar, and your neck and head are working when you squat. So it's a coordination of the body through pretty much every single joint, and so the movement of every limb, every section of your body needs to be properly coordinated, and you need to learn that proper technique. And in learning that technique, it actually teaches you how you need to apply pretty much any movement. Now, I've got some videos on this actual channel. I've got a very basic one called How to Stand Up Off Chairs, which sounds a bit silly, but it starts to sort of cover some of the basics in squat technique. But I go into it in much more detail in a video called Self-Treatment of Patella Maltracking, Parts 6A, 6B and 7. And between those three videos, there's some really good tips on kind of how to perfect the movements that are involved in a squat. And within that, there's all sorts of little movement lessons. So, for instance, there's lessons that look at how the pelvis should be positioned. There's lessons that look at how the neck should be positioned. There's movements that look at how the knee should be positioned to the ankle. Now, you might look at those and think, okay, yeah, well those movements, that's great. That helps me do the squat. But what about all the other movements in the rest of my life? Well, that's the exact point, is that you do the squat as like a reference learning tool to learn the rules of movement. There's certain joints should only move in a certain way, or certain joints only move optimally in a certain way. And the squat kind of teaches those optimal movement patterns for all your movements. What you then need to do is actually start applying those to all the other movements that you do in the rest of your life. And this is where a lot of people don't do this step, and this is why with so many people their injuries come back to them. They'll learn about the pain cycle, like how it's explained in this video. They'll learn how massage helps, and they'll do the foam rolling and whatnot. They'll switch it all off. They might even go to the next step further. They might learn how to squat. They might learn all these rehabilitation exercises. But then the problem is, what they'll do is that they'll do their other exercises. Let's say they like going on the elliptical train, to get their heart and lungs going. That's their favourite exercise machine, say. What they'll start to do is they'll just jump on that the same way they always did before. They won't think about these lessons, these rules of movement. And if you're not applying those rules of movement to the other exercises you do and to the other movements you do in your daily life, okay, even sitting at a desk in an office, you can be thinking about things like your posture and how you're moving and how you're positioning your joints, applying those rules basically. If you're not, these overuse injuries will come back, and they'll keep on coming back, and they'll keep on coming back, and you're just going to get sick of rehabbing, you're going to get sick of pain, and you're going to just look at pain as this thing that's a real burden on your life. When you understand how to move properly and how to fix this, pain ceases to become a burden on your life, but actually becomes an indicator, and it starts to tell you, oh, you know what, my hip's hurting. I've probably been lapse in some of my movement patterns recently. And the more you understand, you'll start to pick up on things that you've been doing in your movement that's been incorrect, and you'll fix that. And then you'll actually see how pain, it does have an evolutionary advantage. And it can be our indicator that can tell us what we're doing wrong and when we need to take action. Over the years, I've had all sorts of movement problems, and I've learned how to correct them. And there's a lot of learning involved, and there's a lot of trial and error involved. But I've had a lot of experience with this. So if you do have any questions on any of your pain that you might have experienced, and you want to know perhaps what movements you're doing incorrectly that might be causing those, feel free to ask a question in the comments or send me a message and I'll see if I can help. Thanks.